Good morning and afternoon, evening, wherever you guys are. Make sure, hey, shout out. I want to see where you guys are from. I love seeing that. Okay, we've got Paulu from India, the first guy in the chat, all the way from India. That's so awesome. I love it. And by the way, I do want to expand our Indian audience. We have a lot of you guys. It's incredible. And I feel like we could round up a bunch more. So keep thinking about that. Who should we interview from India? And we're going to bring on our guests in a minute, but make sure you are ready with questions. We can always throw those in as we go through this. So I hope you guys are doing well. We're getting life going again. I hope in your country too, and certainly in the in California we are, in different parts of the United States, most of the United States. And we have the Blind Husky team from Poland. Do we have the whole team or just a representative? Okay, Lake Tahoe, right on. You're not very far away. And yeah, I know we do want to interview Raghu from India, and I've asked him. We haven't got an answer yet, but we have our fingers crossed. And there's Jared from Chicago and Paul from Canada, Toronto. And it's 7 a.m. or 7 p.m. with the Blind Husky team. And we are, we're 12 and a half hours ahead of you guys in India. That's pretty cool. I know Raghu, I really want to get him. He's a Magnum photographer and introduced to Magnum by none other than Henri Cartier-Bresson. That says a lot right there. So if any of you guys can help me win him over, let me know. There's, hi, Stephen from San Lorenzo. Just one, how can you guys be a Blind Husky team with one person? Okay, that's just a conundrum. We'll have to figure that out. Maybe have other Huskies in there. And we have Joaquim from Portugal. Yes, you're welcome for the programs. And keep telling me where you guys are from. I love seeing that we're absolutely covering the whole planet, it looks like. So cool. All right, I guess we better get this party started. I'm going to officially introduce myself, even though you know who I am. I'm going to do this for other people who don't. So I am Mark Silver. I'm a photographer and author here in Carmel, California. It's so good to have you guys with us. And I want to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by our friends at Bay Photo Lab. Listen, if you've been listening to what I have to say, you've read my books, you know it's important to get your photographs off your computer, off your phones, onto the wall in terms of prints, into books, into cards, any way you want, but make sure you're sharing your work. And photography goes back to its roots of printed work. So I love Bay Photo Lab. They give me great customer service. They'll give you great service. They'll print just about anything you want. They will also give you a 25% discount for being a new customer. So jump on board with them. They're going to really help you out. Okay, now listen, guys. I am super stoked. That means, in California, that means you're really excited to bring on our guest, Cory Richards. He's a National Geographic Adventurer. He's an expedition photographer and alpine climber. Now, as a mountaineer myself, I'm in awe of his accomplishments, and I really mean that. He has summited Everest, and I believe climbed it a total of 3 times, and he's preparing for another climb right now. That's just amazing and mind-blowing. He has climbed numerous other 8,000 meter peaks. That's really high, right? And his photography leaves you breathless, knowing what it took to capture those images. He's also generous as a teacher, both about photography and about life. And Cory, hey, thank you for joining us on Advancing Your Photography. It's so awesome to have you with us.
Thanks for having me. I'm so happy this worked out. It's super fun to be here. And yeah, you've got a great show. So for me, it's kind of an honor, it's fun. I feel like it's like a rite of passage in a way. So I appreciate it.
I'm happy to hear that because I feel the same way. And again, your accomplishments are really mind blowing. So you've been up Everest 3 times, is that right?
I've actually, so it's funny. I've climbed it twice, and I've been on it 4 times. So I'm actually,
Wow.
I've got about a 50% track record with it, and so I've failed twice and managed to get up it twice. One time, the first time I climbed it was without oxygen, and the second time I put on oxygen just, maybe 200 meters below the summit. So yeah, I mean, I have a love affair with Everest, in a very real way, and yeah, I think it comes just it comes from my childhood. It comes from my dad reading books to my brother and I about Himalayan climbers and climbing and adventures that took place there.
Wow. When I was in the fourth grade, Sir Edmund Hillary came to my class and gave us a talk.
Oh, no way.
I'm not kidding. We had a real famous one of my friends' dad was actually a very famous anthropologist. He was married to
Oh,
Margaret Mead, who was big
oh
name,
wow.
and so he knew Hillary. And Hillary came and gave us a talk when I was in the fourth grade, and it really obviously impressed me.
Yeah.
Here is
I
this
mean, that would
guy.
impress me. I mean, that's just, he was such a monumental figure in the outdoor world period. I mean, the world stage,
Yeah,
truly.
because he did it. And later I met Jimi Hendrix, who was kind of the comparable guitar player to Hillary in my mind, the pinnacle of guitarists. Anyway, that's a whole different story. Well, Cory, you and I have so much in common. We were chatting beforehand. It's kind of like between your dad and who you know and who I know, we could go on for forever. One mutual friend of ours is Chris Burkhardt, who's been on our show, and I've interviewed him, in the past. He's just an amazing photographer, and I know you guys have hung out a lot together.
Yeah, Burkhardt he is a strong, beautiful voice in this community. He's one of those guys that snuck up on, I think, all of us a little bit. He
Yeah, he
just
did.
burst out with this incredible portfolio of work that had a real voice and a real style to it. And I think what's interesting is when you look at sort of the ecosphere of Instagram and how images are made, so many of there's so many, and I don't mean this in a critical way. I think it's flattering to Chris. So many people try to emulate his style,
Yeah,
and but there's really only one Burkhardt,
there's only
and
one
he's the
Berkey.
best at it.
And he's no, he really forged that style. You're absolutely right. Well, listen, speaking of images, let's jump into some of yours. So, my first question I always ask, and I'm going to switch over to your images here in a second. But first of all, Cory, what is it that really drives you as a photographer?
Well, I mean, honestly, I I I am a much less technically inclined photographer. And what I mean by that is, yes, I know how to use lighting, and yes, I look for perfect compositions, and yes, I pay attention to technicality, but ultimately what's driven me in this medium is trying to transcend that which makes good photography into the realm of what makes truly transcendent photography and great photography, which I think is an emotional connection.
Absolutely.
And so it's wonderful to make images that are technically perfect, where the light's perfect, the composition is perfect, it's tack sharp, or you're sort of executing in whatever genre or style you really want. It's something entirely different to take all of those components, all of those things that we know that make good photography, and throw them out the window and try to make images that incorporating those principles, of course, but being more inclined towards the emotive substance and the emotional substance that images can have. And
Yeah.
so it's funny, a lot of times people use the word raw when they're describing my photography, and for a long time I felt like that was kind of like almost an underhanded it's like a compliment that's not really a compliment.
Mm,
But I started to look back at my work, and I understand what people are saying. It isn't necessarily designed to be the best technical photography out there. It's more about the emotional connection with, the person I'm photographing, the scene that I'm photographing, or the environment that I'm photographing, because I believe that's the responsibility of a photographer, or at least a photographer in my position, is to connect an audience with their emotional internal landscape in order to inspire some level of outward care or empathy that connects them to something greater than themselves. So
totally.
I'm very willing to forego the perfection, for a perfect moment, if that makes any sense.
No, I'm totally with you. You're what you're saying is you're not a geek, and you're using your camera as a tool to tell that story with an emotional impact, which is really what this art form is all about. It's not about the perfection of technical details. It's about how well you tell that story. Like this image here tells a story. Let's start here. I love this. Where
So
is this and what's going on?
I was doing a story on the Bajo. It's pronounced a number of different ways, but the Bajo people of Indonesia, and specifically an area called Sulawesi. And I had taken a small boat for several hours to a small village that was just outside of a small place called Sampela, which is sort of the main central hub of trade there. And what's interesting about the Bajo is that they have been traditionally a semi-nomadic people that live on the ocean, on boats, that they sort of move from reef to reef, from island to island, but their life and existence is rooted to the water. So they are not land dwelling people per se, or at least have not been historically. What's happened is over the years, because of international borders and such, the Indonesian government, as well as surrounding governments, have sort of mandated that these people assume a national identity and have a permanent residence, which ultimately means that they are going against their sort of historical and cultural underpinnings. And so what's ended up happening is these people have been sort of put in these stilt villages. So they're villages that are built
Oh, I
actually out
see. Yeah.
in the water.
I hadn't even
Yeah.
noticed that until you mentioned it over on the right-hand corner. Okay.
Yeah. So these guys are living in these houses built above the water.
Wow.
And this image is I'm just at a village. I'm walking around, I'm meeting people, and they had this sea eagle that had sort of it had been injured as a young bird and had become sort of a village pet in a way. But for me, this image symbolized something a little bit more powerful than that. And I didn't want to lead viewers down a dishonest path, or an audience down a dishonest path. But what it spoke to was sort of this broken connection between a way that was and a way that is, and an awkward disconnect between a people that historically have been rooted to the environment around them, but then are now sort of reaching for that in a way that doesn't always work, and sort of reaching towards a past that is quickly disappearing.
Let me talk about and make some notes on some of the compositional points that I see, because I love the composition. And I've written a book on composition, and so I'm kind of it's something I always check out. And the thing that you have here, one of the first things I notice is your angle. Like we're not on a straight plane here, which I think is fantastic. And you've got so many different angles going on. You got the angle of his arm and the angle of the bird's wings, and then we've got all these kind of diagonal lines going. Which adds all that vitality to the story. And
It's sorry, go ahead.
no, I mean those are my first comments. I see a lot of other things, but the
It's
composition's
interesting.
fantastic.
I play with composition as much as I can, and I what I try not to do is sort of, throw a tilt on the camera to make an otherwise uninteresting scene interesting.
Right.
What I will try to do is use the camera and the planes, so to speak, and the lines to help aid in a story that already exists. So the last thing that I ever want to do is use lensing, use composition as a tool to essentially make something that isn't remarkable.
Good
And that's
point.
why I shy away from things like fisheye, which of course
Yeah.
have their purpose, and there can be incredible uses of them, or tilt shift lenses, things like that. I don't want my imagery to be underscored by gimmicks. I want
Mm-hmm.
the imagery to be I want the moment to be the image versus the image to I want versus it being about the picture I made, so to speak. And so I remember I was shooting quite wide with this. I
Yeah, I
wanted to
see
be
that.
close to him. Because I wanted to get that spread of the wing to feel expansive. And
Right.
the other thing that I oftentimes do, not always, but I will purposefully break rules of composition if I feel like the frame calls for it. Like, he's dead center, right?
Totally.
But I don't mind that in this. And I also, it's almost as if it's not quite breaking the frame because you still feel like you get enough of his body, but it would be an equally, I think, interesting and kind of telling image if I didn't include him at all and just broke the frame with his arm and hand.
Mm.
So, I love to play with composition. I love to try to think of it in different ways. And I'm happy to break the rules with it when it works. I
Yes.
just don't want to trick people into it thinking something's interesting when it's actually not.
Well, I'm on a big rant about the idea that there's such a thing as the rule of thirds. Like you're gonna get a ticket from the photography police if you break it. I mean, there's no
Right.
rule.
Yeah.
It's a composition guide, and I love the fact that he's dead center in the frame. It wouldn't If we went by the rule of thirds, it would have changed the whole thing. You would have
Totally.
something would have been sacrificed. So
Right.
that's perfect. Was this a geographic photograph?
This actually wasn't for Geographic. This was for a magazine called Terra Mater, which is out of Austria. And I was actually down there I had won an award, which it was the Rowell award for adventure photography. And I had taken some of that, I'd taken some of that award and sort of put myself on assignment. And then this magazine had heard about it, and it was sort of after the fact. They sent a writer down and covered the same story, and sort of I don't want to call it the plight of the Bajo, but I would call it, a story about the struggle for cultural identity in a modern world.
Perfect. Well, speaking of geographic, I wanted to open with this one because how does it feel? I mean, come on. The 125th anniversary, you're on the cover. It's not only, and you took the photograph, right? So this is your
Yeah.
photograph, and it's you.
Yeah. It's
That's
this
kind
is
of
an
amazing.
this is an interesting moment. We live in a funny time, and selfies,
Yeah.
as a thing, they're part of our cultural context. They're part of our cultural conversation. I mean, Kim Kardashian made a whole book of Instagram selfies, and and nothing against Kim, like, that's remarkable to understand your audience on that level and to be able to
Sure.
market to that. This was an image that was taken descending off a summit bid from and a successful summit of the first winter ascent of a mountain called Gasherbrum 2 in
Mm-hmm.
Pakistan. It's an 8,000 meter peak. We were the first team to summit any of the Pakistani 8,000 meter peaks in winter. And I think I'm still, as far as I know, the only American to summit any 8,000 meter peak. And we had been descending for 2 days, and we got hit by an avalanche shortly before this photo was taken. And this photo was taken, you know, I would say directly after, but it wasn't seconds after. After we had dug ourselves out, we all three of us nearly died.
Wow.
Um,
Wow.
but we all survived. And this photo was taken shortly after that. And it was an image that at the time, I think I think I knew that there was something transformational happening in my brain and in my
Yeah.
body. And that's quite consistent with having a near-death experience.
Yeah.
Our brains sort of go into hyperdrive, and the experience oftentimes gets trapped in our brain, and we look for resolution, and that manifests in behaviorally is what we all know as post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah.
And in some ways, I think I felt that. And I felt there was something happening in the moment that was worth observation. And in another way, I think it was me trying to get away from the experience, almost get away from it by distracting myself through photography. And I think that's a useful tool for people that are in, or it's more of a, it's a method that people that find themselves in high emotional situations often employ, which is to get behind the camera, which removes you from having to be immediately emotionally invested in what's happening.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is actually part of what I was trying to do. Is I was feeling so much that then I was trying to get away from it, but the only place I could turn my camera was on myself. And so this image became sort of a calling card. It's probably my most well-known image, if you can call it famous. It's
Sure.
This is probably the one. But it also symbolizes the beginning of a deeply transformational unraveling of my personal life and some dark years emotionally and interpersonally that were ahead, as well as launching my career in a way that I never really could have imagined. So it's a very dichotomous moment.
Yeah, I can see that. It's almost in your expression, somehow telling all that. Well, let me ask you how. It's kind of amazing. I'm sure you look at it and have your own set of experiences, but from an outside point of view, not knowing what happened, not knowing about the avalanche, obviously something happened here, that's what draws you in. And I love the reflection on your lens there, which
Yeah.
adds a whole other kind of element to this thing in terms of another layer. How did you do it? Just technically, what were you using at the time? What were you shooting it with?
It was actually a point and shoot camera, because my
Really?
bigger camera had died. And so it was gosh, I forget even which camera it was. But it was just it was a pocket camera
Point
that,
and shoot. Wow, isn't that amazing?
yeah. The original image is actually a JPEG. It wasn't set to RAW. I just had the camera around my neck, because the other big camera the batteries were done. There was, ice and fog and condensation in the lenses and the body. And this had sort of survived this 6-day sprint to the top of the mountain. And I remember pulling it out and actually thinking about the focal length that I wanted. So I just zoomed, it had a sort of an electronic zoom,
Yeah.
and you could watch the lens telescope. And I knew roughly where I wanted it, which was about 50 millimeters. and just turned it on myself and held it out with a straight arm in front of me and shot several frames. Uh,
Bam.
that's it. You know, it's
I've
it,
got to jump in here on something. So, I mean, listen, one of the things we love to myth bust on this show is that you've got to have the latest and greatest piece of equipment in order to be take a good photograph or make a good photograph. And you have proven with an unnamed point and shoot, the cover, not just the cover of National Geographic, but the cover of the 125th anniversary. If that doesn't really tell the story, I don't know what does. Cory, thank you for letting us know that. I never would have guessed. But it isn't about the technicalities of that image either. It's about the story that you have told, which is what you've been talking about.
well, and that's the thing. People always ask, well, what cameras do you use? And of course, I'm a Nikon ambassador, so I
Yeah,
always, I talk about Nikon. But the truth is, yes, if you're going to be a professional, have professional tools. And I always promote that brand because I work with them. At the end of the day, though, if you are on the street and an incredible moment is unfolding before you, your phone is great. Anything you have to
totally.
capture an image, capture it, and move forward with that knowledge that it doesn't have to be technically perfect. It doesn't have to be, the latest and greatest. In fact, I would say that most of the most transformational images that have been made during the history of photography have not always, quite often, are not made with the latest and greatest.
Yeah.
They are a moment that occurs that sticks with us because of its transformative and sort of transcendental power.
Well, my little collection behind here, these are cameras I've used. This is the Leica M2, which is what Henry Cartier-Bresson took all his photographs with.
Yeah,
My Rolleiflex that I love dearly. This was my first 35 millimeter, an Argus C3.
yeah.
But the significance of it was that you had a camera that you could control. But yeah, it's about how you use these tools, not about the obsession with the latest piece of equipment. Well, let's jump into some more of your images here, Cory. So this is a mind blower. This is your summit, right?
Yeah.
Everest.
So this is, it's such a the summit of Everest is an interesting place. I mean,
I
obviously
guess.
it's a unifying place. Um, it is, I often paint the picture, if you imagine the world as a teardrop or a drop of water, Everest is that pinnacle from the point from which all else flows outward and downward. And I
Right.
believe in that symbology because I do believe that there is something unifying that brings us together as a human family that is encapsulated in that place, on that point. Not everybody will see it that way or understand why I speak of it that way, and that's okay. But when I was there alone. We always hear of these big lines and we see the pictures, and that
Yeah.
does happen.
Yeah.
Um, but I was there alone. My partner had turned back. Uh, I had come up just after the last party that was up there had turned around and gone down. So my first time visiting the top of the world was I was isolated. I was singular, and it was incredibly powerful to be in this place by myself, and incredibly powerful to see how unassuming this place is. There's no God ray. There's no,
Right.
there's no choir. It doesn't happen like that. It is a lonely, uh, desolate place that people have come to almost in form of pilgrimage. And that's what these prayer flags are about. A lot of people looked at this and they see trash. These are actually Tibetan prayer flags that are
Okay.
left as offerings. And the way that prayer flags work is that there are Tibetan prayers written on 5 different colors of flag, different prayers, And the way that they work is that as the wind blows, those prayers are released into the world, right? And
Wow.
so, and then it becomes almost sculptural, where they become part of the mountain as they
Yeah.
freeze into form here.
Fantastic. And this one, so this was, you said this is the peak down the valley a little bit.
Yeah, this is a mountain called Ama de Blanc. Ama de Blanc is it's been called the most beautiful mountain in the world. It is iconic for sure. This is a less familiar angle of the mountain. There's a more familiar angle where, if we were to show it, people would go, "Oh yeah, that mountain." It's been referred to as the Matterhorn of the Himalaya.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's just a iconic mountain because of its shape, and from every angle it seems to have this geometry that speaks to grandeur. It's not something that falls away or is sort of lost amongst the other mountains. It sticks up and stands out, and because of that, it's become almost a symbol of what mountains are, and what mountains can be, and the mystery that mountains hold. And I was walking over a pass. Actually, no, I believe this was taken from a base camp on another mountain, on an opposing mountain, and the clouds just sort of opened up briefly as they were swirling around the summit, and I was able to get a couple frames of this moment that to me spoke to exactly that emotive quality that this mountain sort of is celebrated for. It's big, it's scary, it's ominous, but at the same time, it's representative of something beautiful, and I think innately human, which is that desire, that need, that want to discover. And for some of us, that has been, most easily manifested through climbing to the highest point we can find and looking out and surveying the landscape around us. For other people, that is most easily manifested by paddling out into the ocean.
Yeah. Well, the triangle is a symbol of strength and stability, and that's what you see here. From a technical standpoint, so this is a digital image, right? Not
It,
film.
it is digital, yeah.
It has a very film look to it, though. Do you, in terms of your processing, do you process in Lightroom? What is, just briefly, what is your workflow like?
Well, what's interesting is I learned, I was one of the last classes to before Photoshop was a sort of a tool in the classroom. So I learned on black and white film.
Yeah.
My first years learning to shoot were, developing my own film, and processing that in a dark room. The
Mm-hmm.
first year of my photography career, when this guy named Andrew Phelps, who's still a dear friend, urged me to pursue this as a life path. I was learning from him in Salzburg, Austria, at a school called Salzburg College, and at the time the school was in this old building that, if any of you are familiar with Salzburg, there are these buildings and these homes that their facade essentially sticks out of a cliff. And our dark room was in the cliff. It was carved out of the stone and back. And
Amazing.
yeah, it was really cool. And the smell in there, because it was so earthy, you could feel that humidity and that smell
Yeah.
coming, from the stone. And we go in there, and of course, I mean, it was sort of an otherworldly place to learn how to do this work. And so with black and white photography, I've always worked to emulate tonality that
Yes.
black and white film offers. And if you've ever studied tone,
The
be
zone
it,
system.
yeah, the zone system, if you've ever really looked into that, that sort of incorporating, or it can be really useful and beautiful to incorporate as many of the zones as you possibly can,
Yeah.
and expose for that. If you can expose correctly, then you can really bring an image to life. Now, that's not to say that at times a purely black and white image, like truly black and white, isn't deeply powerful and moving. But I've always tried to process towards the appearance of film. And in doing so, I use all sorts of tools. Oftentimes it depends on which camera I'm using, what file is coming out of the camera. But, I'll use Capture, I'll use Lightroom, and I'll use Photoshop. And they're all used for different things.
Yeah. I think it's interesting, those of us who did come through the darkroom days and studied Ansel Adams, in the zone system briefly, you guys, if you haven't studied it, I actually wrote a description of it in one of my books. But basically you have a scale that goes from pure white to pure black, and which you have in this image, and then shades of gray in between. And it does make for a very impactful image, as opposed to before I went into the darkroom, everything came back kind of muddy gray. Mm-hmm. There wasn't a pure white and there wasn't a pure black. And when I learned that you could do that in the darkroom, it just completely, that's when I became a photographer. So it's the magic, right?
That is the magic. And once you start to understand that, you really, and then you can see it in other people's photography too.
Yeah.
One of the masters of that was Avedon, and
absolutely.
And his portraits of the American West. And what's important to know is that Avedon knew, and this is, I think, an important point about photography in black and white, but all photographies, Avedon knew what he was exposing for. That was his job. He went out and made the photograph. His printers were the ones that really brought those images to life in the form that we now know them. Now, he was exacting. He knew how to direct the printers, but that is an art form unto itself. And I am strongly an advocate for people to look at photography and identify what they like in somebody's work. And if they can't do that, literally, there are people that just do processing for images, and they can bring your images to life so long as you know how to expose for what you're going for ultimately.
So true. Well, listen, let's jump into some of your portraiture here, because
Sure.
I wanted to cover, I'm just skimming through. I love this image, and again, another black and white.
Yeah.
There's something about it. I haven't really figured out what it is, but it definitely grabs me.
So Kyra is a friend of mine, and she's one of my best friend's wives. And I am a lover of natural light. When I was an assistant, I was taught how to shoot to natural light. Mm-hmm. I worked in, commercial fashion for a long time, and that funded my trips that I could then go out and shoot adventure stuff. What's interesting is as I've evolved in photography and I've moved back towards a lot of those principles that I learned in those early days. And this image is actually one of my more recent ones. I absolutely love it. And I think part of it is simply the expression and the exchange that Kyra and I are having.
Yeah.
And it's knowing, I think this is another point that is really interesting with photography. It's knowing which frame to pick, right? Mm-hmm. It's because there are plenty of Kyra that occurred around this that wouldn't be nearly as impactful. But there's a moment here. There's a genuine exchange. There is something that's being communicated between her and me, or at least her and my camera, that is, again, I know I abuse this word, but it's transcendent. Yeah. And it becomes, at once mysterious and familiar. It seems confident but inquisitive. Yeah. And what allows this to be a really, I think, important, beautiful picture is that the light isn't wanting. I'm not doing something crazy with my light here. I'm letting light do what it knows how to do. Yeah. This is natural open shade against a gray wall on my porch. There's nothing fancy about this. The only thing that I added was I had Ryan, her husband, hold a small fill card to give a second catch light. But
Oh, there are those
that's
catch
it.
lights. I was going to ask you what those were. So
It's
that explains it. Yeah.
it's just a window. The main
Right.
catch light in her eyes is just a big open window. And then there's a small, tiny one that's down and left that is actually just a small fill, a small bounce that Ryan's holding.
Fantastic. Yeah, you have all those elements, and it's like she's listening, but you can tell she's engaged and about to say something.
Yeah.
And that's the power. To me, the power of it. It's like you feel connected to this conversation because of that.
Again, it's knowing which image, and I cannot stress this enough. People always, I don't want to say they pick the wrong image, but they pick an image that they think is the right one versus looking for an image or a moment specifically with portraiture that is moving beyond what we think we're supposed to be looking for, or what we think is the image that we should pick.
Yeah. And getting back to Avedon, he was the master of that.
It's 100%.
Especially since he was shooting mainly with an 8x10.
Right.
For you guys that don't know what that means, look at a sheet of paper that's 8 inches by 10 inches. That is the size of negative he was using. He wasn't click, 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 click. You can't do that with an 8x10 camera. And it's a big format, huge format that gives you super high resolution prints. But he set this camera up. And what Cory was saying is that he went through the West and just with a portable backdrop, which would be similar to what you had. It was either mostly white, though, as I recall, white backgrounds.
Yeah, his were mostly white. He sort of created a white box.
Right. But the master of interchange with that person. I remember actually talking to Annie Leibovitz about this. I mean, she said she's nowhere near as good as he is as far as getting that emotional. I mean, she gets what she gets, but he was really about getting that connection with the person and having that kind of dialogue with them and finding like you said, the right frame. That is really powerful advice. I want you guys to listen to that. Because you're right, we can be kind of led down the path of what we see and we think we should show rather than what really is the image that's going to have the most impact. Very true.
It's funny. I mean, when I was shooting Al Gore, it was the same thing. For him and for his purposes, I know it's important. I knew it was important to, and I know we don't have that image up.
I do actually. Let me bring it up here. It's on a different screen.
Yeah, it's right on my. Yeah,
there he is.
So this image of Al Gore is interesting because it. I knew that shooting him. I don't know why that's blue. That's interesting.
Yeah, I'm trying to get rid of that. Let's see.
But it's. Okay. I mean,
I'm going to go out of that just because at least we can see it as it's supposed to be. There we go.
Yeah. I mean, so what's interesting about that is, again, it's I'm looking for a frame in that represents my work and my experience with somebody. Of course, there's other frames that he liked better for the purposes that he wanted, right? Which is more for speaking or for anything that his, climate reality organization wanted to use. For me, I wanted an image that spoke to, I think, some of his thoughtfulness, a little bit of trepidation, something that seems more personal, that's a little closer, that feels more vulnerable.
Yeah.
Oftentimes people want to project strength or they want to project a knowingness, and that can be useful to capture what they are trying to project. For me, I've always wanted to look for that moment when the guard has been dropped and there's something being said without saying anything at all. And so, again, there's ways to do that with lensing that brings you closer. Like this is essentially a 35 millimeter lens. So you get a little bit of distortion, but it also feels really up in his face.
Yeah.
but at the same time, there's a softness to it. And again, I'm just talking about picking the right frame.
Yeah, that's very important. Why don't we take a few more and then we'll see if we have some questions. I'm going to go back to that other. There we go. I wanted to ask you about this, Alex.
Yeah.
So for people who haven't seen Free Solo, this is the man who climbed El Capitan with no ropes. Unbelievable accomplishment. And this says a lot about him. Tell us about this image.
So I was hired by ESPN to shoot for their body issue, which is when they take a handful of incredible athletes who have done something notable or have just lived an incredibly prolific athletic life, and they shoot them. They're photographed entirely naked and nude, which is it's meant to be a celebration of the human form, and really it's meant to be an expose of the adaptation of the human body in response to the stimulus, the unique stimulus that is applied to it. So a sprinter's body looks very different than a golfer's body, and a golfer's body looks very different than a cyclist, and a cyclist looks very different from Alex. Athletics and stimulus, the stimulus of athletics, create wildly different figures, and the human body is wildly adaptable. But so there's an element of just wanting to show raw physicality and show how Alex's specific body has adapted to his sport. Beyond that, there is a sense of Alex has within him a sort of there's an element of being unreachable. There is not because he is a dark person necessarily, but because the way his brain is structured, at least this is the way I interpret it, it is beyond the comprehension of most of us to understand. And I wanted to at least display or get at that wall and feel like I was up against it and trying to dive behind it, and also having a genuine exchange with Alex without words. And so this image was meant to, and oftentimes these things happen sort of without knowing it's happening. So long as you have a clear vision of what you're actually trying to get with a sitter in terms of portraiture, and having a concept, generally speaking, you'll find a frame that works to that. Oftentimes you'll be surprised and, maybe it doesn't happen. But in this case, it did. It was exactly that moment of saying, okay, I know the lighting. I know I want open shade. I need him styled. So we're really celebrating the highlights and the shadows that are created by his form, so we can at once be introduced to the physicality of this, because that's what this issue is about. At the same time, we can take a step further and dive into sort of this inaccessible reservoir of emotional mystery that allows Alex to accomplish the things that he has and perform at the level that he does. And that's what I was really trying to get at here so, initially I wanted a little more catchlight in his eyes. But then I also realized that too much of that breaks down that wall. So
exactly.
I wanted
that. I just noticed that before you mentioned that there's this sort of the absence of light shows how drawn in he is. And you're right. There's the wall right there.
Yeah. And his eyes, his eyes are these big, like dinner plate, dark eyes. And I really wanted to celebrate that too. It's like his pupils are, and his irises are that they're like, they bleed into one thing.
Amazing. So how was this lit, and where did you take it?
So actually this is lit, in his, we created a studio out of his van door.
Okay.
So we opened his van door, and then we took black like muslin cloth and just blacked out the whole interior of his van where he lives.
Amazing.
And then he's sitting in the door, and we've got a big scrim overhead to create the open shade and that sort of glowiness.
Okay.
And that creates that really beautiful diffuse light that is, but
Yeah.
it's enough to create shadow and highlight. Um, and then there's some oil, some light oil applied to his skin that helps catch and amplify those highlights. Now,
Yeah.
again, this is one of those images that I handed off to LeBlanc Studio to actually do the post processing using gosh, why can't I? Oh, Peter Lindbergh and some of his work, specifically some of his frames, as a guide for the kind of tonality that I wanted.
Okay. Well, you really tell that story, and from what I know of Alex, that really does show that side of him. And the fact that you did it in his van is even cool. There's
Yeah.
there's you wouldn't know that from looking at the photograph, but that adds another dimension to it. Okay, well, listen, do you guys? This is amazing, Cory. I could keep you here all day, but I wanted to get this image, and then if there's any questions, you guys send them our way. This is an amazing photograph.
Oh, thank you.
So much passion. I mean, it tells a story. So what is going on here?
Well, so Hazel Miller she's, I think, one of the most beautiful vocalists and sort of, I don't know if you could call her specifically a jazz vocalist, but a lot of it has been jazz. If you Google her, Hazel Miller, you'll find her, and you can listen to her. Her voice is stunning. It's deep and soulful, meaningful, and resonant, and I wanted to celebrate Hazel the way I understood her as an artist. And so this was part of a personal project that I did called Icon, which was a collection of these incredible sort of under the radar people that live here in Boulder, Colorado. And there are many of them. There are many really quite famous people that live here. And she is one of those performers and artists that has taken up residence. And I wanted to celebrate her in this image in the way that I imagined her on stage. Mm-hmm. So it's almost meant to look like stage lighting. Not quite as dramatic, not quite as contrasty, but the way this is lit, and again, this is so important for people. People always want to know, they think they need 18 lights to make a great image. And the truth is, at most, you need one.
Right.
And oftentimes you don't need any. It's just knowing how to work with light. So this image was created with a single light source, one beauty dish that was angled, at a pretty classic sort of almost Rembrandt style, a little bit more frontal than Rembrandt, but up 45 degrees. And I simply asked Hazel just to sing for me. And I fired through that performance. And of course we warmed up, we chatted, we talked before this. And then I asked if she wouldn't mind singing a little bit, but my whole goal and my concept around this was to create an image just like this. And I wanted it to feel, and oftentimes I try to create images that you don't know exactly what the emotion is, because that brings you further in. Is this a cry? Is it a scream? Is it is she just singing? What is she singing? What is she singing about? And I think that's important. I want to give people an experience that answers as many questions as it asks, but also asks as many questions as it answers.
And it does that. It really does. It draws you in. You feel her power of her voice, but you're right. You don't know. Is she? There is a question. Is she freaked out, or is she belting out something and you don't quite know. I mean, you
Yeah.
just feel it though. You feel that raw energy and emotion in that photograph. Well, we have a question here from Neil Shat who says, shooting portraits for a while. I want to do more seriously now. I have only shot natural light so far. How do I proceed? Well, you kind of answered that question, but what do you want to say?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I'm a huge fan of natural light, and I believe that learning to work with natural light to accomplish the goals of portraiture that you have in mind is essential to being able to create the portraiture with studio lighting down the road. However, I will say that is natural light is hard to own. It's hard to really call natural light yours. There are people that have done it, but it's very difficult. And what I mean by that is, yes, Avedon he kind of owns that black and white
Yeah.
background natural light. Herb Ritz owns some natural light. You look at harsh shadows and things like that. It's so what I'm trying to get at is natural light is wonderful to study and it's one of my favorite ways to shoot, but it's hard to make a distinct impact with natural light other than allowing the person that you're photographing to speak for themselves. When you look at people like Marco Grubb, for example, who's a Swiss photographer, and I encourage everybody to look at him. He is a master of creating light. And that becomes more signature-esque, where you can, and Annie Leibovitz in some ways, she created a sort of a very simple lighting scheme that is recognizable as Annie's at times. And so I guess what I'm getting at is when you get into using lighting, first and foremost, play a lot.
Yeah.
Challenge yourself with it. Try to figure it out. I'm not interested in watt seconds and understand. I don't care about that
Yeah.
stuff. I'm interested in how the final product looks. So start with one light, and that's all you need, and figure out all the things, literally everything you can do with a single light. Just start with one. And,
Right.
I'm a huge fan, if I'm not using the SB series, which is, speed lights,
Right.
by Nikon. I use the Profoto B1s because they're a battery pack. They're portable. They put out enough power that you can overpower the sunlight. But my
Yeah.
my challenge is when you start introducing lighting, try to light everything from behind for a day, just with one light. What does that look like? Try to light everything, figure out what light does. And in doing so, you'll start to craft and understand your own voice and the things that you like. And also look at other people's work a lot and try to figure out how they did it and then emulate it. It's pretty simple.
Those are great pieces of advice. And I hesitate to ask you any other question because those are just two really good things to keep in mind, you guys. Absolutely. One light source, play with it, get to know how it works, and also look at other people's work, which we talk about a lot. I'm going to ask this one last question here from the Blind Husky team. You asked two questions, but I'm going to just use the second one, which is there any person or thing you really want to shoot more than anything else?
Oh, it's
I
such a good
assume that you
question.
haven't. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I there are people that I would love to photograph, but again, I don't think that's quite that's not the answer I want to give. I Let me answer this very honestly. No, there
Sure.
is not one thing. Um, I'm so curious about the world. I'm curious about what's happening in the world now, and I want to be directed by what is happening and what's unfolding on the planet. And I want to evolve with my work in a way that helps and leads me towards what needs to be told versus putting my sort of what I want to tell on it. I think there's something important about following your passions and following your heart as to what the stories that you want to tell. But I am in a distinctly privileged place where I can offer what I have as a tool set to be employed to tell important stories that need to be told. So I want to sort of surrender that toolbox to the world, as it were, and be guided by that. And I can be deeply moved by pretty much anything that I'm invited to shoot. And I think that's the greater thing here, is just be curious about everything and you will make good pictures.
Beautiful. Cory, that's a good point to end on, because you guys can take that and put it to use right now. And everything you've gone over, Cory, is immediately accessible. That's what I love about it. There's no fancy special equipment, as we've discussed. You could do this right today, you guys, in your own community with your own friends, and practice these points, master them.
I mean, you look at the greatest imagery of all time and the things that are transcendent. You look at how people have shot. One of the things, genres of music or genres of photography that I love to look at is music, and not stage performance. But look at the most important images of the greatest bands of all time. Look at Harry Benson, right, and how he photographed the Beatles. The images that are really impactful and stand out are not stage performance. They're moments that he found his way into by being close and vulnerable with the band members to create a personal connection that allowed him access to places that other people couldn't go and moments that other people wouldn't see. And because of that, he created a body of work that gave us a greater picture of what and who the Beatles were. And that can be practiced and used in your family, right?
Yeah.
You have access to your family to create transcendental images that tell the story of what family means. You have that access with your friends. Practice that. Practice your own vulnerability. Practice your own ability to get access. And you will build a body of work that speaks so much more than technically perfect work.
Well, Cory, thank you again. Your generosity in sharing, and the work that you've done, and your training for Everest. So I know we've taken some time away from your training time. When is that climb, by the way?
So the climb is, we're trying to do a new route, something that's never ever been climbed before.
Wow.
Just my partner and I on the northeast face of Everest, and we will be there in April and May of 2021.
Okay, well, we'll be able to follow you. Are you going to be doing it on Snapchat again?
I don't know if we'll do it on Snapchat this time, but we'll be able to follow. We'll find some cool way to make it accessible.
Awesome. Well, good luck with that, and thanks again. Really awesome to have
man.
you on the show. Okay.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
You bet.
Take care.
Okay, we'll catch up in a second, Cory. Hey, listen, you guys, that was friggin' amazing, right? I have a list of things that I'm like, my head is exploding and resonating with everything he said. And take these points, put them to use, practice them, get your single light source, find that person. It's all about using what you're learning, and it's all about following your passion. So fantastic. Okay, a couple of things. Tomorrow, Bob Holmes is back with us. Robert Holmes, another National Geographic photographer, will be joining us again. And frankly, I think we're going to wing it. I don't know if we have a topic yet, but we're going to catch up with him. And then on Friday is our good friend Dan Milner. Dan and I had a conversation a couple days ago about an attitude shift that we kind of wanted to help people address and realize that your attitude as a photographer has everything to do with the kind of work that you put out. And as a matter of fact, your attitude in life, it comes from you, and the camera that you hold is just, again, a tool. So we're going to actually kind of zero in. It's a bit of a philosophical discussion, but an important one. And you guys love Dan. You're going to love that show. So that's Friday, same time. Bob tomorrow. We've got some really cool stuff coming up. We have our calendar of events. Make sure you're tuned into that. Jared will put it up here. Grab a hold of some prints from Bay Photo Lab. Take advantage of their offer to give you a 25% discount for your first order. Make sure you're in our AYP Club Facebook group. If you haven't already joined it, please get in there, because that's where the discussion will continue. And we can actually have people post examples of like what Cory was talking about. That would be amazing. And just put your work out there and, start a discussion. If you haven't already subscribed, please do so you don't miss any of our shows. Our channel is really growing, you guys, and I want to thank you for everything you're doing to make that happen. I love having an international audience. As I said, I want to grow in India. I want to grow in South America. I want to grow, essentially wherever we can reach photographers. We're English speaking, but we actually have had some translations going on because of our community, which is fantastic. So listen, you guys, my goal with advancing your photography is to continue to help you advance. That's why I called it advancing. It's a continuous process. So I know you're doing that because I read your comments, and I love hearing from you guys, and I love having you on board with us. So last but not least, leave your comments, and very last thing is remember to get out and capture your own images of life. Love you guys. See you really soon. Take care. See you in the AYP Club.